Welcome everybody to this webinar, Beyond Globalization and Deglobalization, Search for Planetary Coexistence. I'm very happy to have Julia, Eder, Heikki, Patomäki, Sarah, McKinley with us here for this discussion. My name is Andreas Novy. I'm working at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And I'm president of the International Karl Polanyi Society, the organization that is organizing this event together with the support of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And I'm very grateful for this support, which we have already received in the past and hopefully continue receiving in the future. The event is embedded in activities we undertook before, and we will continue undertaking, because this topic of globalization, deglobalization has been with the International Karl Polanyi Society since our conference in 2 years ago, where a paper by Karl Polanyi on universal capitalism or regional planning, written in 1945, was one of the key texts of the conference. We had a webinar in December where we already discussed the article that I've written on the political trilemma of social ecological transformation, lessons from Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. And we had a panel and discussed it. It's available on our website. And we continued the discussion with Dani Rodrik at a virtual event, but organized by our sister institute in Montreal. And we plan to have a further event in September. You have all this on our website. Melissa is showing it to you. A further event, here you have it, on policy spaces for social ecological transformation. The intention is that the discussion we have today is somehow an input for the event in September. The idea is to organize this very much as a dialogue. The basic literature, I think we've put it in the chat. You can access the PDF of the article. Some of you might have already read it. We will not repeat it. I will simply very quickly show you one graphic that's in the article, and that's on the trilemma, which is inspired by the trilemma of Dani Rodrik. And Dani Rodrik's trilemma, which I think was very timely, problematizing hyperglobalization already 20 years ago. You have it in front of this, is that you cannot have the three policy objectives, hyperglobalization, democracy, and nation state together. You have to sacrifice one of them. That was his key argument, and the key argument is you should sacrifice hyperglobalization. If you switch, Melissa, to the other trilemma, my trilemma is an adaptation of this, and that's exposed in the article, is in fact, it's a trilemma where you don't choose 2 out of 3, but you pick one which becomes the core policy target, and the other objectives are secondary to this one, and that means the 3 policy objectives are liberal globalism, which adheres to hyperglobalization, and what's called by Merkel and others market-conform democracy, and the nation state also has a role, but the key is hyperglobalization. in the article, I argue that there is a shift away from neoliberals to a more nationalistic form of capitalism and selective trade nationalism, not only Trump, but there are other examples, and somehow even Chinese capitalism can be characterized a form of this. That's a more authoritarian form of capitalism, but it does not abdicate all elements of neoliberalism. And as that's the argument of the article, liberal globalism is in crisis. We urgently need an alternative to this nationalistic capitalism. And that's in the article called Foundational Economy based on Planetary Coexistence. But it's an attempt somehow to strengthen local agency without neglecting that you need national and global regulations. To put it very quickly, we'll discuss this more, and that somehow justifies our speakers that we have here in front of us. It's Heikki Patomäki from Finland. Thank you very much that you are here. We before just discussed he is making a break from his holidays, which are special holidays that we just learned about this, but it's holidays anyhow. Thank you very much. He is a social scientist, and also that's what he calls himself, a political activist. Professor of world politics in Helsinki and a docent at the universities of Lapland and Turkey. And he is an associate member of the steering committee of EuroMemo, one of the organizations co-organizing this event with us. He will start the speaking after I present the other two speakers. And it's Sarah McKinley. She is Director for European Programs for the Democracy Collaborative and the European representative for the Next System project, working out of her office in Brussels, but we just learned that she currently is in the US, as the Democracy Collaborative is a US initiative of grassroots activism, of fostering community well-being, building, community wealth building, and interestingly already right from the beginning with a strong social and ecological concern. I think that's important also for our project and our discussion here. And finally, Julia Eder. She is head of the Mattersburger Kreis for development studies at Austrian universities, also one of the co-organizing institutions of this event. She is lecturer at the BFE in Vienna and is finishing her PhD on trade in Mercosur and the Eurasian countries, somehow and strongly involved in these issues of local, regional, global interplay. Yeah, after having presented all the speakers, I hand over to you, Heikki. Please start the discussion.
Thank you very much. I was asked to outline agreements and disagreements, and so I will do. I start by sharing the screen. I have a few slides to show. And I think this is in the wrong order. Now it should be okay. So the title is Beyond Globalization and Deglobalization. Nothing surprising there. There are two alternatives outlined by Andreas. liberal market globalism and nationalistic capitalism that are the targets of criticism, and we certainly share this. There are deep problems with both, and they should be rejected as approaches. I will very briefly explicate some of those problems in a second. So we are both looking for alternatives to these two models. It seems also that our analysis and values are green and social/democratic. I write it in this way in order to emphasize the distance from the currently existing or really existing social democratic parties that have been very much involved in the neoliberal transformations of the world during the past 30, 40 years. But we share the basic values. And at the end of the article, there's a section called Foundational Economy based on Planetary Coexistence. And when I was looking at those proposals in some detail, it seemed to me that we agree about every single concrete proposal outlined in the section. Of course, they're open to different interpretations, and they can be prioritized in different ways, and there are many other things that could be discussed, and so on and so forth. And as far as I can see, the first half of those concrete proposals, in fact, describe the situation as it currently exists in countries such as Finland or the Nordic countries. That even after all these decades of neoliberalization, so we have municipal swimming pools, we have public systems of health and education, transportation and water, and so on and so forth. And so that's something that is already in existence, at least in some parts of the world, in spite of hyperglobalization and so on. The second half goes beyond this, and it suggests that democracy should be deepened. Andreas mentions democratizing the workplace, also the welfare institutions as well. And he, in fact, also lists some global reforms as well. And I'm in total agreement with all of these points. Where the disagreements lie are at the general orientation, the basic categories that are being used, because the argument, the main thrust of the argument is directed against globalism or planetary way of looking at things. And there is even the term coexistence, which is a kind of a Cold War term that simply means things that are existing side by side and somehow leaving others, the other beings just to be, which would seem to imply a kind of a very far-reaching program of deglobalization. The argument is to a large degree based on Penny Rodrick's political globalization trilemma, which in turn is based on an analog to the so-called Mundell-Fleming model. And this is a kind of a classical or neoclassical model that is based on claims that certain things are impossible to combine. However, when we look at the source of that, the globalization trilemma, the Mundell-Fleming model, in fact, it involves all kinds of assumptions that are not, in fact, true, such as exogenous money supply, perfect international capital markets, inelastic exchange rate expectations, and so on and so forth. None of these assumptions, in fact, hold. And if you look at things from a more realistic perspective, and it is, I mean, especially post-Keynesian economics and framework, none of the main results of the Mundell-Fleming model, in fact, follow. And it doesn't matter whether the exchange rate regime is a floating or fixed one. So the source of the model is flawed. There's also another assumption that comes from neoclassical economics, namely the idea that there is some kind of a sovereign policymaker that somehow can mix freely various available policy instruments to achieve optimal results. And this is based on the modeling logic of neoclassical economics, where you have a model about something and then the policymaker is assumed to be outside the model, or typically. I mean, there are models that also include the policymakers as well, but they are different rational choice models. Of course, the model may limit the options to a large degree. So only for certain kinds of policies may be assumed to be available, etc., etc. But the point is that the model is totally ahistorical, and the policymakers assume to be outside that model and somehow being able to manipulate certain things within the model. Moreover, the mixture of things is understood in a quantitative way. So, for instance, I mean, it's not simply that there are certain impossibilities or co-impossibilities, but rather what Rodrik is claiming, that you can in fact say reduce hyperglobalization by 2 units and then divide that between the state and democracy, get 1 unit more of each. And I think this is a somewhat problematical assumption. And in fact, I think there are some false choices here. If you look at this basic scheme, you can see that there are 3 options: hyperglobalization, nation state, and then democracy that is also equated with mass politics. This is ahistorical. But when we know something about history, we know that all the contents, all the qualities of these categories are have historically evolved, have been contested. There are different ways of thinking about these things, like globalization, for instance. I mean, in the classical sociological sense, it's about compression of time and space, intensification of social relations across time and space. And this has nothing to do with hyperglobalization in the sense of market integration or neoliberalism. It's a very different notion. And there are many other understandings of globalization as well. The same applies to the state, which is kind of a modern, early modern European category to start with, but I mean, it has been a contested notion. There are many theories of the state, many different variations of the state, many types of state, and so on and so forth. And the same holds true for democracy as well. So all the concepts, all the practices, and all the institutions are in fact historical and varying. It follows on this that also free market globalization would be very different from social/democratic and green globalization. So there are different kinds of globalization. If we in fact had something like global democracy, that form of globalization would be very different from Danny Rodrik's hyperglobalization. So in fact, there are more possibilities than what are depicted by Danny Rodrik. There are also all kinds of conceptual ambiguities as well. So for instance, I mean, what could sovereignty mean in the absence of political autonomy? So the democracy or the definition of democracy and the state are connected in that way. So for instance, and if you choose 2 of these, like hyperglobalization and the state, but if hyperglobalization means that you are committed to free market arrangement or institutions, I mean, what sort of autonomy is there left? And so there are all kinds of issues here that are in a way replicated in my view, also in Andreas's version of the trilemma. Finally, I will make an argument, an emancipatory argument in favor of globalism. I have to summarize a lot, I have to simplify a lot, but here we go. What is emancipation? From a critical realist perspective, emancipation involves always the transformation of the sources of determination, and I'm talking about causal and constitutive determination, from the actual but unnecessary to rationally needed and wanted ones. So it is freedom in the sense that we can shape and influence the sources of determination, including self-determination as well. A necessary step in this conception is explanatory critique. In the process of emancipation is explanatory critique. So there has to be something to be explained first, and then we can have a better explanation. We can also explain the circulation of the prevailing or illusionary way of thinking about this outcome and the process behind it. And then we can, if we have a theory about why it is being reproduced, we can also make a normative argument in favor of transforming those social structures that are responsible for this reproduction. So to make things, complex things, as simple as possible, why did the Bretton Woods system and related projects of social democracy and democratic socialism fail in the decades after the Second World War? I mean, they seem to be doing fine until the early 1970s, and then something happened, or at least until the 1960s. My answer in a nutshell is that the situation in the mid-20th century was highly exceptional. The world economy that was already highly integrated and globalized had temporarily disintegrated because of the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War. Reglobalization occurred immediately after or started immediately after the Second World War. And with this process of reglobalization, the structural discrepancy between territorially bounded states and the increasingly liberal and global world economy started to widen. And this resulted in changes in power relations that many actors started to exploit. And these changes in power relations, in fact, favored neoliberalization. In my reading, I mean, there are a number of other premises and assumptions that I can't go through here. But I mean, in my reading, this means that, I mean, if we want to emancipate ourselves from the currently prevalent false necessities, we have to globalize democratic politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Heikki. Thank you very much. That was very precise and clear argument. I think I simply hand over to Sarah to give her presentation.
Thank you very much, Andreas and Heikki, and thank you for everyone on this panel for having me. As Andreas said, my name is Sarah McKinley. I'm with the Democracy Collaborative. We are a US-based think and do tank that advances models of economic democracy in place, but we work transatlantically, mainly in the US, UK, and Europe to advance models, as Andreas said, of community wealth building. I'll start my remarks with just a little bit of a preface, especially after following Heikki. I am not an academic. I'm not a researcher, so I am not as well read, I imagine, as my esteemed colleagues on this panel. I am a connector and an activist and a student of on-the-ground projects. And I'll be sharing with you today some examples that I think fit very nicely into the framing that we have from Andreas's article on the foundational economy. And that's largely where I work and where the partners and organizations that we support work in, and where community wealth building as a model of economic democracy fits. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that in my remarks with some concrete examples of some of that work in the US to get folks thinking. I know that Julia has done a lot of research on these models in other places in Europe and beyond, and I'm sure she'll speak to that as well. So hopefully I can take some of this great framing and this great contextualization within the theory of this work and make it concrete with some examples. So really, to start with, getting to this notion of the foundational economy and what Andreas prefaced in his presentation of that in his paper, that we really need to democratize other spheres of our life and not just sort of have democracy reside only in the sphere of politics and policy. And in fact, you can't really have a society or a system that is half democratic and half plutocratic. And what you are seeing is a plutocratic global economy that is essentially eating our democratic politics and resulting in a lot of the sort of nationalistic capitalistic movements that you're seeing these days. Andreas mentioned Trump, but everywhere from Bolsonaro to elsewhere. So we're seeing that we really cannot have this plutocratic economy really living or attempting to to live next to sort of the notion of a democratic political realm. So our goal is to democratize the economy and actively democratize the economy from the ground up. So how do we talk about that? My organization, the Democracy Collaborative, what do we believe needs to happen? So we believe that in order to properly democratize the economy, we need to have a revolution in ownership, changing who owns and controls capital and productive assets in place, so that we're not just tinkering around the edges of a destructive and extractive system, but fundamentally restructuring that system and the institutions within that system so that they not only work in service to community, but actually produce positive outcomes by their natural functioning. You hear, and we sometimes talk about the notion of pre-distribution rather than redistribution. So structuring and creating institutions and systems at the front end so that they produce benefits rather than having to ameliorate the negative impacts of a system after the fact through redistributive efforts, as we are doing currently in our current system. So we believe that you can do this starting locally through what we call community wealth building. So community wealth building is a system-changing approach to place-based economic development, and it produces broadly shared collective economic prosperity through the direct reconfiguration of our economic institutions and local economies on the basis of greater democratic ownership, worker participation, and community control. And again, the theory of change there is that to service their own needs in productive ways and have their needs met, then they can also understand themselves sort of as an actor in a broader democracy. Getting to begin to envision that sort of global democracy that we were just hearing about. So there's a lot in that definition about community wealth building, and we are always working to refine and hone that definition so that it's a little more elastic and usable, as it is meant to be bespoke to the assets of place. But really the key understanding, the key principles of the transformative capacity of community wealth building to really create economic democracy in place are the principles of ownership, place, institution building, and system change. So as I said before, it's not just tinkering around the edges, it's overhauling our local economies so that they thrive for the people that live there, which requires redesigning institutions or designing them from scratch, from our local governments to our enterprises, so that they are locally owned and the control and economic advantages of that ownership, the wealth and benefits of that ownership are spread and shared broadly and not extracted to benefit an elite few at the top. So this can take many forms, from employee-owned cooperatives to municipally owned enterprises to democratized public utilities to community land trusts and other models. Some exist, some need to be created. It's an evolutionary process. And many already exist in your communities, in communities across the world, certainly in many social democracies in Europe, but also in places like Chile, and places in the UK and in places in the US like Cleveland, Ohio, which I will speak about in just a minute. But imagine if some of these efforts, things like cooperatives or things like mutual banks, what if they were connected not only to one another, but to local economic engines, institutions like local government, universities, hospitals that could use their levers of power, link and were linked intentionally to local organizations, local enterprises, to really create a diversity of economic activity in place and an explosion of local solidarity and mutual aid. Imagine if there was supportive regulatory and legislative frameworks around them, and imagine if there was abundant resource to increase community capacity so that they can develop these kinds of alternatives in a way that meet their own needs. So you start to see the beginnings of systemic transformation in all of those connections. If we were able to make those connections really powerfully, we could truly take advantage of this moment to really build back better and not just have that be a slogan, that we could truly see new political economic systems starting in place and building to all levels for full system change. And so to turn to the example I was speaking of in Cleveland, Ohio, you begin to see a small scale local system that begins to offer a glimpse of different scales that we can connect these things at. And Andreas in his article spoke to a multi-scalar approach to this. And this is one example from the ground, but we need this to be connected into regional and supranational and global support systems. So in Cleveland, Ohio, the Evergreen Cooperatives are a network of green employee-owned cooperatives located in largely disinvested post-industrial communities that are mainly populated by African Americans living well below the poverty line, with large barriers to employment, including coming out of the criminal justice system in the US and being unable to be employed. We're talking about neighborhoods where the life expectancy for adult male is about 20 years lower than that of a neighborhood just 8 miles away in the suburbs that are generally affluent, generally have pretty large economic disparities in a fairly small area. And unfortunately, you know, the statistics in Cleveland, you're looking at poverty statistics, infant mortality rates, illiteracy rates, you know, things of this nature that are equal to places like Detroit, but unfortunately are less and less uncommon, not only in the US and in post-industrial areas, but in many places across the world, and particularly in the industrialized global North and Western democracies. So the Evergreen Cooperatives were deliberately created. They were formed intentionally through a collaborative effort among the institutions of the city of Cleveland, the City Council of Cleveland, a network of hospitals, universities, arts institutions, cultural institutions, connected to community-based organizations, workforce development groups, and so forth, to develop this network of employee-owned cooperatives that would supply goods and services directly to those large anchor institutions, those hospitals, universities, and others that are rooted in place. They won't get up and leave. They have to provide goods and service. They have a mission to serve those communities, and can operate from other directives than profit motive, and also actually depend upon the viability and well-being of the communities around them. So today, about 10 years later from the original formation of the first cooperative, there are 3 evergreen cooperatives that now employ over 200 people locally, all of whom earn a living wage, have the opportunity to share in the benefits of and the profits of the corporations, and are connected through a community-owned organization that then is accountable to community residents that make up the board and actually have a vote and a share in the say of the future of those cooperatives. Additionally, there's a revolving loan fund that can then a share of the profits go into to create additional cooperatives and capacity for the cooperatives. And most recently, there's a new fund created to actually start buying up distressed enterprises and that would be closing or bought up or asset stripped or sold, and to buy them up to help convert them to employee ownership so that they stay in the community as viable enterprises moving forward. And most recently, so this is where you start to see hints at scale. Just the other summer, the cooperative laundry, so one of the 3 cooperatives is a green industrial scale laundry facility that does laundry for the hospitals in the region. They beat out Sodexo, a large French multinational corporation that services many hospitals globally for laundry and other services. They beat out Sodexo for the full contracts for all of the Cleveland Clinic, which is the largest regional hospital in the area. And they were able to, with winning that contract, buy out the Sodexo plant, which was located in the suburbs, convert it to a fully green, it reuses wastewater management and all of those sorts of things, a fully green facility, and then converted all of the existing employees of the Sodexo plant to employee owners. So not a single job was lost in that transaction. And in fact, the whole degree of wealth was created for that community and for those people working in that factories. So again, you start to see that implication of scale, and you start to see that really what is essentially a local industrial planning strategy. And of course, what is really the innovation here is getting the commitment from the locally rooted institutions that then, in a sense, create, for lack of a better term, a protected market for these enterprises to operate in a way that allows them to thrive and produce. And of course, I'm sure we're going to get into that and the concerns around protected markets and so forth in the conversation, so I won't go into that. But this is just a one example of many that are out there that are really beginning to create these foundational economies, this democratized economy in place. And you start to see the potential to create solidaritous regions and networks of this work around the globe. And there are many exciting examples, and I look forward to hearing from Julia and others about those and how we can work to connect those as a real alternative to where we are now. So thank you so much for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We have now a global entry point, a local entry point, and I'm sure, Julia, you will link the two, and that's why I hand over to you. Looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, hello from my side. Good evening to everyone. I will try now to find some common ground between what I said and also to point to some differences where we would probably have heated discussions when we would be together at a table. So first I wanted to say that I agree to many points that Heikki made in his presentation, but one very specific I do not agree, and that's that the concepts that are presented in this paper would say that hyperglobalization has been the same in each historic period and in each place. This is not what the paper says, because it actually says that there is a period where hyperglobalization in the 1920s and 30s had some features that were not exactly the same as in the 1980s and later. And I think this is a model, right? So you try to have some general concepts and then you really have to apply them to make them concrete in the analysis. And I think the model works for this, but it does not say that actually the concepts or the features have been exactly the same in each period. And I think it makes sense to apply this kind of concepts, because one point that is raised in that paper is that hyperglobalization, or that the period of the 1920s and early 1930s and today were similar. And I would agree to this for different reasons. And I think that there were more or less the same challenges present. Back then, mostly discussed as social challenges, but today, actually, you could agree that it's also ecological ones that are on the table. And the question is how to react on that. And the paper actually says, well, there are counter movements. So nationalistic capitalism and foundational economy, or some more locally based strategies, try to respond to those challenges that are on the table. I agree to the necessity to act and to really try to find some policy space for concrete measures. But I think in the left, it's currently very much contested where you can find those kind of policy space and where you should start to act. So this is also why we invited Sarah and Heikki, because I think they have different opinions on where is the best place to start, what is the appropriate scale, and also how can you interact between the different scales in order to find a compromise or some kind of cooperation maybe between groups that have a different view on that question. So what I think is really interesting in this paper is that it actually says nationalistic capitalism tries to resist structural change. So it tries to resist international competition and climate change, and it promises that this is possible. Whereas foundational economy actually says you need to regulate and promote structural change in the sense of the majority of the people of society. Also trying to establish a good living for all. And I think this is the way we should also think about it and debate it. What has to be done in order to improve the living conditions for the majority, but still thinking about people living in a specific place and having specific bonds to that place. And this is why I think that the foundational economy and also community wealth building is a really interesting approach, because it has this bottom-up strategy where it tries to mobilize the community, to mobilize people living in a specific place, no matter what is their exact background, but just living there, to live there better together, to regulate capitalism and to regulate the negative consequences of the free movement of services, of goods for those communities, very specifically. So this, in my opinion, is a good starting point, and it's also the local level where I think that you can mobilize people for another future, because that's where people come together, that's where people discuss, and that's where people also reflect their reality, and they can exchange their ideas and so on. However, as also stated by Sarah, that cannot be enough. So you have to have a perspective about higher scales. And I will say something that's not so popular in the left in many cases, and that is that the nation state is a place, or it's a container for change, for policy space. So this is also a scale that has to be relevant for us if we think about changing the conditions in which we live. I would say it's not the container, it's not the most important element for progressive policy making. It can only be one among different actors in different spaces, but we definitely need to analyze what kind of policies, public policies can we implement on the nation state, but still having clear that the state is not one monolithic entity, but actually there's different interests present in the state apparatus, and it's a question how to shift priorities in the state apparatus to favor groups that might not be included right now, or that have worse services, worse living conditions than others, in order to improve the living of the people in a specific place, without being racist or thinking that anyone else should be excluded from those benefits. I think the real important question is, do we live at the expense of others, or is our strategy designed in a way that we do not live at the expense of other groups, of other regions, other cities, other communities? And that should be the guiding principle, I think, in anything that we do. Also, I agree to what Heikki said in the beginning, that obviously there's very different starting points if we look at different countries. I would say that in Austria we have a similar situation like you have in Finland. We have still quite a stable foundational economy that works for many people, even if it is exclusionary in some ways. But in many other places, this has never existed that way, or it has been eliminated. So the question is, how can you re-establish it where it has existed and has still some kind of tradition? And that's what community wealth building and the foundational economy tries, in my view, in the UK and in the USA. And the other question is, how can you build it in other regions of the world where it does not exist right now? So that's how I would approach this question in a very broad way. I will leave it here because I'm sure that we will have time to debate, and there's lots of things that we can still discuss about later on.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I will. There will be possibilities to join the discussion, but for a moment we'll stick to the four of us. And my first question, now having heard the presentations, question to Heikki, how I assume that there is not a lot of disagreement with the strategy Sarah has proposed. But how do you relate and what is necessary from global governance to support this, and how does the proposals you have in mind relate to this, and in how far are they feasible? Yeah, and then afterwards, the similar question related to Sarah, what in your understanding has to be a better form of global governance? Is there anything that has to be deglobalized, and in which respect? Yeah? So these would be my two questions to the two of you. Yeah?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, it must be emphasized that global is not the place. I mean, everything in the world is happening in some place or another place, but global is not the place. It's a scale. It includes and incorporates everything on the surface of the planet Earth, but I mean, it's in itself, it's not the place. Global reforms are a priority in my view, partly because of my analysis of the reasons why neoliberalism has reigned during the past 40 years. It has to do with the discrepancy between the territorially based politics and a global economy. And so we need to democratize also global politics. The globalized democratic politics. Global reforms are needed to create spaces of autonomy everywhere in different places. And the different systems of global taxation, global regulation are needed for that very purpose. I mean, think about some global Keynesian reforms. The global currency transaction tax was also meant to increase the autonomy of a monetary policy of different states. Or the International Clearing Union proposal of Keynes in the 1940s that has been reinstated by a number of thinkers, including Paul Davidson and Joe Stiglitz and others. I mean, they have developed it to new directions to a certain degree. The whole point is to actually enable rational economic policies in different places. I mean, it's exactly to reverse the imposed austerity on different countries in the global south, but nowadays also in the global north as well, by different international institutions. It's a different way of organizing things, and the whole point is to increase local and national autonomy as well. But it also means that there is a global system in place, which means that there's much more political integration than there currently is. So in that sense, you can say that there is more globalization, but it's different kind of globalization. In some ways, some of the flows would be reduced at the same time as well. The same holds true, for instance, think about global corporate taxation, for instance. I mean, there has been an understanding. I mean, Biden's government has finally taken the initiative to globalize the system of taxation, because it has been realized that it's very difficult for one single territorial state alone to increase the level of corporate taxation. You need to cooperate. So you need to have a global system and global agreement in place. It's a modest beginning, and there are all kinds of flaws in the plan. But it's still a great step, if not a leap, to the right direction. And there are many other things as well that needs to be done in the same way. If you want to find global corporate power and create alternatives, including for cooperatives and democratically organized different work organizations, you need to tackle corporate power also on a global level. The cooperation is a kind of a social mechanism that has been legally created, but it's also almost like quasi-constitutionally guaranteed on a global scale through different international agreements and treaties and so on and so forth. So you need to revise those, and that's a matter of priority, in order to be able to tackle corporate power and create more space for democratic autonomy in different places. So I don't think that the local autonomy, or whatever is meant, that the local can also be understood in a non-territorial way. So for instance, I mean, if you have a organization that is working in different places across the world, you can still democratize those practices. I mean, you can still have workplace democracy, for instance, within that organization, even though it's not in a one city or town or something like that, but it's actually spread all over the world. And so the point is to increase local autonomy, including in the sense that local is understood non-territorially as well. And so in that sense, they are not exclusive. I don't see that there would be a choice. I rather see that the global democratic politics is a condition for local autonomy to really increase in any place on the planet. Of course, you can have temporary small-scale victories here and there, but that scale is too small. If you want to really make a big difference to the masses of people and their everyday lives, you need to tackle these global systems of power.
Thank you very much. I mean, the question is, and now I hand over to Sarah, my concern with what you just said, Heikki, is I totally agree that it's desirable and would be the first and best option. I don't see the feasibility of this. And now switching to Sarah, I have the impression, taking the Biden administration, that there is a shift differently from the Obama administration, which, at least in beautiful words, aimed at global governance, and we know that it was not that successful, but the focus was definitely a good form of global governance, whereas the Biden administration, in my reading, is much more offering a national framework favorable to local initiatives. So how do you see this in the US context, and then perhaps compare it, as you know, the European one as well? What are the framework conditions and what's decisive?
Well, I'm not going to pretend that I have the answer here. I think, like all things, this is iterative, and it's a both and. It's evolution. I mean, to your sort of point in the article, this is a evolutionary transition, right? And we don't entirely yet know. I mean, as Heikki was just saying, I think we need both and. You know, we need the global governance to stop the bad acting. We need, you know, I'm not a reformist. I don't want that to be the end goal, but we need it now so that we can get there, right? We need those reforms. We need to stop the bad acting. We need those restrictions so that you can enable the flourishing at the local level, that experimenting, that alternative. We need alternative mechanisms. To the example of the corporation, I would argue that we need to break up the corporation. It needs to actually not exist. But in order to do that, we need to change legal and regulatory frameworks at a global level. And at the same time, we need alternative. What else is there? What can supplant the corporation in terms of jobs and meeting needs and supplying goods and so forth? So we need to have those things happen simultaneously. Now, to your point, as to how do we get there, are we going to get there in what we have? And that's the harder question. And that's where we might be looking at more of the revolutionary transformation. And that might be what's going to have to be brought about by our climate collapse that we're beginning to see and feel the effects of. I think, I think the Biden administration is an interesting example and an interesting question. We still don't really know. Biden's administration is doing more locally in the progressive vein than was expected. On the other hand, there's an interesting sort of balance, tug of war, I don't know what you call it, of sort of that then co-opting the real sort of progressive potential and alternative potential of the on the ground work that you have seen in in a lot of communities in the US. And so that's sort of a tension that has yet to play itself out. And yet, you know, what does that mean globally, and will Biden or the US be in a position to sort of make those kinds of global changes that we need at the scale and the radicality that we need? I don't think so. And I don't see it from Europe, to be honest. EU, I mean, in terms of that sort of supranational Europe, I don't see that leadership coming. So I don't have the answer, and I'm afraid that is going to be something that our hand is going to be forced on. I think we're going to have to do the best that we can do to lay the groundwork, and we're going to find ourselves in multiplying periods of crises that we're going to have to sort of reactively respond to too late, frankly. So I think we're in for an interesting decade or more. I wish I had something more concrete to say. I'd love to get the thinking of the panel, because I think, and the participants, because I think our best bet is to really try everything we can and be as collaborative and as radical and experimental as we can. So.
Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, in a few minutes we will open to the audience. Let's say like this. But first, Julia.
Yeah, thank you for everything that you have said now. I totally agree that it would be very good to have a global governance that works in a very different way and that prioritizes different values. But I just don't really see it. And I also feel that the debates are quite limited and restricted to not too much change at that levels, at that scales. And this is somehow related to how I perceive the world economy and who is powerful and who can shape how the rules work in the end. So that's also why I think to wait for a progressive global governance in order to try to take steps at other scales is not sufficient. I think what you really need is to have an analysis for each scale. What can you do as a person, but most likely as a group, as a movement, at a specific scale in a specific moment. And this is actually what you have to elaborate, or what you have to convert into a strategy that is multi-scalar. That's the way how I would see, that's the task that I think that we have. If we want to promote the social ecological transformation, you need to, to bring together different scales in the analysis, but also to be very clear about the specific opportunities and also limits that are linked to that scales. At the global scale, I have also some kind of question or doubts. How much pressure can I put on the real powerful groups? And for example, transnational companies, they just have some kind of advantage in organizing themselves, considering the rules of the global economy. And it will be very hard to counter that power just by trying to negotiate for new rules. I think there needs to come some pressure from other scales. And I think that the local scale, also the national scale, the regional scale, also the EU level can be very crucial scales for, it's creating that kind of pressure that might change something at the global level.
May I very quickly say a couple of words? First of all, I mean, these changes are a matter of learning, and that also applies to the global scale as well, and especially to the global scale. Some of these reforms, some of these changes have been quite close to realization. And in fact, there was a momentum, particularly after the Asian crisis in the late 90s and early 2000s, where some of the proposals, I was, for instance, at that time fighting for the so-called Tobin tax, or the currency transaction tax, also developing a model. We even drafted the treaty for global currency transaction tax. And in 2004, the Belgian parliament, in fact, enacted a law based partly on our draft treaty. But by that time, 2004, the momentum of the so-called anti or alter globalization movement was already over. And that was a result of number of changes and things. I mean, they're all things that can be different in the future and could easily become different. Things like many of the global civil society actors via NGOs that we are funded by Western European governments, basically. And this government started to actually set very strict conditions on that funding. I mean, it became more limited and also more project-based, and there was more surveillance over these organizations and so forth. That was one thing. There were other global changes. I mean, the Bush government started after 9/11 to push for the global war on terror. And that changed the global agenda in all kinds of ways. And there's always a kind of a dialectics between crisis and learning. I mean, once you have a kind of a major crisis like the Asian crisis of 97, 98, after that there was a learning process and new movements arose and so on and so forth. But after a while, after things normalize, I mean, the momentum is very easily lost. And that's what happened also. And because of these other changes, after 2007, 2008, during the global financial crisis, nothing similar happened. I mean, it was a kind of a saddle point, a beginning of a kind of a regressive period in world history, where this nationalist populist movement started to take over in the absence of credible alternatives that seemed to be there only a few years before that moment. So we have to think about these things historically. That's one thing. The second thing is that many of the things that we are facing, I mean, many of the problems that we are facing are truly global. I mean, we are talking about socio-ecological transformation, but global warming is not something that can be tackled by the United States or the European Union only. The EU, for instance, is only responsible for less than 9% of the global emissions. So you need to actually have global systems in place, like a global greenhouse gas tax, for instance. Otherwise, I mean, you can't tackle the problem itself. And there are many other similar problems with regard to global economy, but I would also say that the question of war and peace is extremely important as well. I mean, we are again facing the real threat of nuclear war as well. These are global problems that cannot be tackled at the local level, however much you try. So for these reasons, because I see it in terms of process, historical processes that are contingent and change very quickly, in terms of learning, and learning is happening all the time, and because many of these problems are global by their very nature, that there is certain priority to global actions. That doesn't exclude local actions or other kinds of actions, of course not. And there can be also kind of a division of labor, some people specializing on this and others on that, and so on and so forth. So I'm one of those who is specializing on these global reforms. That's my thing. But I also think that there is a very strong normative case to be made for seeing that as a priority as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heikki. First, talking as a facilitator, you can ask, as Melissa said, questions in the chat. We will even try, if you want to raise your hand and to unmute. That's always a little risk, but that's possible. We are not too many, and you're welcome to join the discussion. But in the meantime, I think, Heikki, the problem, your argument, I hear very often from industrialists, from people not interested in reforms, that global problems have to be solved by global solutions. That's why we are against national tax of this, and we are against this type of national policy intervention or European. So it's a very effective excuse, the border adjustment tax. You have written on this, the border adjustment tax of the European Union. For sure, it would be better to have it at a global level, but very often this idea of looking for global solution is the best way to kill an idea, especially given the current Russia, China, US geopolitical constellations. So I think here I see the problem with your approach, why I have a certain inclination towards second best solutions. And in this sense, I agree with Roderick on because I think that you can, and in this sense, as you yourself strongly argued, I think you can solve global problems by local actions. I mean, there are limitations, and it's better to have additionally some type of global regulation, but it should not be an either or, and very often, or sometimes I have the impression it goes towards an either or.
Just one short remark. There's a difference between creating new international law and changing the existing international law. And in a way, the current neoliberal arrangements have been secured by almost constitutional international arrangements, because international law is still sovereignty based and very difficult to change in the absence of consensus among all the states. However, it is possible to create new systems of international law, new systems of governance by a coalition of the willing, a grouping of countries that agree on certain things, and then they invite others to join later on. And there we are in the 1990s, two successful cases in this. One was the ban on landmines, and the second was the International Criminal Court. They both were started by a kind of a civil society movement and a leading state that took the initiative, organized the conference for the interested parties, and then they created a new international treaty asking other countries to join later. And that's the scheme with which we can actually realistically think about changing the systems of governance that we have in the world at the moment.
Sarah?
Yeah, and I know I wasn't very optimistic sounding in my last comments, but to maybe sound optimistic, I mean, never underestimate the power of peer pressure, right? And if you have things like the coalition of the willing, and you start to see actual results delivered in place, you can't underestimate the power of that to start to sort of snowball, if you will, to grow and to impact. And we at the Democracy Collaborative talk about laboratories of democracy. So for example, during the Great Depression in the US, what ultimately became our Social Security program actually came out of a small group of people in Alaska pooling together their resources to support the elderly in their town. And then when the New Deal was going through and Roosevelt was looking for alternatives and looking for things that could work on a national scale, they looked at that example and then rolled that out as our social security system in the US. The same is true for the NHS in the UK. Nye Bevans in Wales sort of experimented with socialized healthcare there, and then that grew and became the model for the NHS. Now, again, these are national scale examples of sort of things on the ground influencing broader policy, but I'm sure there are equal examples of that happening at a supranational or multinational level. And so that's sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about these both and. We need to have these reforms, we need to have the check of the bad actors, but then we also need to have this activity on the ground to show the alternative, to show what's possible, and to then create positive pressure around that. I mean, you recently saw, so Preston in the north of UK has been operating with a community wealth building strategy for a number of years. They're a Labour council. While much of Labour lost votes in the last election, Preston was one of the few that gained. So what you're starting to see is that the actual results on the ground that improve people's lives, that make a difference in their lives, it almost, the politics is not, it almost doesn't matter as long as it produces results in people's lives, and it starts to create sort of, and then that gets picked up by national level, parties, and then by actual, implementation of policy and so forth. So that's sort of what we're trying to do by that multi-scalar impact, show what's possible, deliver real results, and have that snowball and create an impacts broadly.
Julia, you want to add something on this?
Yeah, maybe I want to say something to the question that was raised in the chat. That was, do we think that bottom-up processes will be decisive to overcome this crisis? I would say that this COVID-19 pandemic crisis is another moment in history where we have to learn and where we should try to build back better. I think there's an opportunity open right now, but I also see strong forces that try to reestablish capitalism and globalization as it existed before, with some changes. I think there will be more state capitalism, a stronger role of the state in the global economy, but I do not see some big major changes in how to face, for example, the ecological crisis at a global scale, nor at a regional or national scale. I do not really see that huge debates. Now the debate is green growth and how can you grow in a green way, try to build back the economy, but it's not really a reflection on how we produce, what we produce, and also what are our consumption patterns that are linked to this way of producing. And it's not only about production itself, because it's true that the EU has quite low CO2 emissions in a global, globally or compared as a global share, but because we have offshored all the production sites to Asia. And so if we count all the CO2 emissions that we import now with products that our population consumes, it does not look so nicely anymore, our share in the global CO2 emissions. So I think that that's things that we need to consider and discuss. And for me, this local scale is so important because I think that's the scale where you can raise consciousness for that kind of mechanisms. Obviously, you cannot resolve everything at the local scale, but it's the level where democracy can work and also where learning can work, where you can really improve knowledge and try to find new solutions in a participatory way. That's why I think the local level is important. And then there's one last thing, a question I wanted to ask Heikki. If you talk about this global governance, and I'm missing the actor. Who is the actor in your case? Is this the policymakers that are actually, that have made everything that they have done up until now and then they should change? Or who is putting the pressure on those policymakers so that they would change global governance? That's what is it about that I have.
Should I answer?
Oh, yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the successful reforms have sometimes followed the scheme that there's some academics developing ideas, civil society movements pushing for those ideas and developing them further. And then at some point, in some cases, like in the case of the International Criminal Court, that took a century, more than a century, in fact, before the changes started to happen. So sometimes it can take a lot of time as well. And the current ICC is far from perfect. I mean, in fact, it has been facing all kinds of crises, and can actually, the whole system can collapse as well. Because, I mean, viability is another thing. I mean, the feasibility, I mean, political realizability is one thing, but the other thing is that the institution is also viable, that it is designed in a manner that makes it legitimate. Now, I mentioned earlier that the current system of international law is problematical for many reasons. One is that it's very difficult to change. That means that it's also very undemocratic. So whenever a kind of a new system is put in place, and we need governments for that, because only sovereign states at the moment in the current system can enact new international law. So we need governments. But the thing is that, I mean, the new systems have to be designed very carefully, and they have to be made more democratic than anything we've seen in systems of global governance so far. The UN system has certain underlying democratic principles. There are some other organizations that also consult NGOs or have civil society representation. There are those kinds of things. But to have real decision-making powers, the parliamentarians and the and civil society actors is another matter. And also to see governments in terms of representing their populations. So you have weightings, so different countries have different amounts of votes depending on their population and so on. Of course, it doesn't have to be like strictly corresponding to their population, but there can be different categories. And you can combine different democratic principles. So you can have different like parts of the system or different houses, perhaps like you can have council of ministers and you can have house of democracy, and then you can have systems that are inclusive in the sense that non-democratic or authoritarian governments can also participate without nonetheless losing the democratic nature of the system. So that takes a lot of designing. It takes a lot of new clear thinking and new kinds of insights as well. But it's totally possible, and there are all kinds of models for that. So there are various stages. I mean, there's a process where something is being initiated and pushed. Civil society is very often important in that regard. You need to get governments on, at least some governments on board as well. You need to create a new system. Then you have to design the new system in a way that makes it truly radical. I mean, in fact, establishing new principles of governing the world system. So you need all four.
Just to question, because I've not just to get it clear. Yeah, you argue in favor of these global institutions, and I doubt the feasibility. And you gave some examples, but the examples, they didn't touch the economic sphere, and that would be one of my doubt whether that's possible in the current situation to have agreements on substantial issues in this domain. That's the one thing. But the other thing where there might be a common ground, and we have not talked about this that clearly, the global regulation can also consist in reinforcing more decentralized forms of economic exchange. Is this, in this respect, do you agree that, because that's a little bit what Sarah is suggesting, that the global regulations should favor through transport costs, slowing down supply chains, global supply chains? Is this part of the, let's say, global governance that you imagine, Heikki?
In fact, yes. I mean, among other global taxes that I've been thinking, I mean, one is a global transportation tax. So you can actually make the transportation across the planet more expensive than it currently is. And that would, of course, slow some very long distance trade, slow down to a certain degree. And that's quite important. I mean, the certain localization of certain systems of production, I think, are ecologically necessary. As said, I mean, I'm very much in agreement with many of the proposals, concrete proposals that you put forward. I mean, the disagreement lies in whether we stress the importance of global reforms, whether we are globalists in that sense. And we very often defining the 1960s slogan, think globally, act locally. My version of that is think cosmically, act globally.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, one thing we haven't mentioned too, sort of, and thinking of this transportation tax, I mean, there's almost a first step that isn't even done, and that's what's even measured and what's even assessed. So right now, often things are measured by what is their lowest cost per unit, especially when you're talking about procurement or contracting services or supply chains and things like that. But what they're not factoring into account of the cost of per unit of something is the actual costs of the externalities and things of that nature. So, for example, just one example with going back to the examples in Cleveland with the evergreen cooperatives. The previous model, when the hospitals, for example, worked with a GPO, a group purchasing organization, which is normally a large multinational logistics company like like Sodexo, like Aramark, something like that. What they do is they aggregate product, in this case laundry, and usually they ship it to where they can get that product serviced for the lowest possible labor cost. So they were taking laundry from Cleveland, Ohio, and shipping it to the south of the US, even Mexico, places like that, to get that laundry done for something like 10 cents a pound or something, because they, could barely pay people and have them live on, intolerable conditions and all sorts of things. And then they'd ship it back. But the cost of shipping, like quite literally the actual cost of shipping, wasn't factored into the cost of the price per unit, nor were the environmental externalities that were caused by that kind of way of doing business, nor were the interruptions in service. So for example, if there's a large snowstorm in Cleveland, which happens quite often, and they can't get their shipments of laundry from Mexico, then you have a huge problem with delivering health services at a hospital that doesn't have laundry, and they weren't factoring that into the cost either. So it's not even just that we need to have taxation or regulation on the impacts of these things. We don't even really understand what the true costs of them, because we're not measuring them. We're looking at a very sort of false indicator of economy in price per unit or something of that nature to try and determine profit, and not factoring into account a lot of these other things. And so we really even need to start, with that, ensuring that those sorts of things are measured so that we understand the full impact and can make different choices.
Thank you very much. Just for the discussants, there is a question in the chat. Please have a look at it by Klaus Seib. And we are slowly getting to the end of our webinar. And as I said, the webinar is a milestone, but it's not the end. And there will be another one in 2 months' time on policy spaces for social ecological transformation. Julia, you can respond to the question in the chat, but also what's your suggestion, what's your conclusion, do you recommend the discussants in the next webinar when discussing policy spaces for social ecological transformation, given the discussion we just had with Colleen Schneider? We have in the audience one of the discussants of the next webinar, so you can very directly make a reference to this.
What I wanted to add to what Sarah said, I think it's totally right. What we measure and what we consider important or not is problematic to some extent. But I also find that today it's quite problematic that there is this fixation on costs, prices, and taxation coming about. And that's problematic because it does not consider social inequality appropriately, in my opinion. So if I tax, I have to answer the question, I feel, what do you do with people who have to pay more for a good or a service and get so low wages that this becomes a problem for them? So that's why I think this, just to call for higher taxes and to say, okay, that's how I can resolve this problem. I think this is a very short-term view that might even increase the problems inside the societies, and in the end might promote nationalistic capitalism, because they will actually argue, well, you just have this problem now because we had to tax, because we had to find a global solution. If we find a national solution, it will be cheaper for you again, so vote us. So for any kind of solution you have, I feel taxation might be a part of it, but it has to be really socially sensitive in that case. But in a broader sense, I think we really need to reconsider what we produce and how we produce it. And I don't really see this debate. It's just about producing it in a green way right now. But I'm missing this really, really deep going debate about what do we actually need, and is this system sustainable in what it produces? And I think this is also where the second webinar will follow up, raising exactly this kind of questions. How can you actually change the way we are living in a way that we do not feel it's a huge sacrifice and our life is worse now, but in a way that we feel, okay, I still have the things that I need to be happy and to have a good life, but it's not so polluting anymore, and it's not at the expense of other countries in the global south. So that's what I would say is the goal in my view, and I hope that you debate about that. And it's a complex thing, obviously, but I think for a debate, it would be interesting to have some different perspectives on how we might approach the goal in that case.
And there is just, if I understand the comment in the chat correctly, it's more as two elements. One is a little bit directed to Heikki, that the UN or the global institutions, they talk a lot but have little power. But the second point is our task simply to alleviate the worst, that the marketization dynamics are the way they are, and what can be done is alleviating, and then it's a little bit what Sarah would be part of this alleviating strategy, but not the big way forward. Is this modesty acceptable, or have you should we reject this this type of interpretation? Heikki, Sarah, whoever wants to speak.
Okay, it's very true that the UN systems have very little power, and many other international organizations as well, which makes them less interesting from the point of view of citizens. That's precisely the reason why I've been stressing so much the global tax organizations, because they could actually command major resources, and they could also be organized in a democratic way. So what happens there is actually something that has an impact across the world, can have an impact across the world. The UN budget at the moment is something like a few $billion US per year. It's nothing. It's just look at the fire department of New York, for instance. I mean, it's the same scale basically. The Tokyo fire department is the classical example. And so the existing international organizations are powerless. And that's the reason why I've been also critical of the idea of World Parliament, to the extent that it is only a kind of a symbolic place for representation rather than a real decision-making body. But because we can't create a sovereign legislative body either, you have to use your political imagination to create a kind of an alternative conception of what the World Parliament might be like. So that criticism is very true, I think. But this is something that we don't need to reproduce in our own practices. I mean, the idea is to create something better, more powerful and more empowering. The idea is also that these new systems of global governance wouldn't be just alleviating the existing problems, but would actually be creating the political spaces for more radical changes and reforms. That their task is also to enable further reforms. I mean, it's an evolutionary process, but you have to create the conditions for the right kind of an evolution to take place. Thanks.
I mean, I certainly agree with regard to it being an evolutionary process, and we do it sort of in degrees as best we can. And I certainly agree that global structures need to ameliorate the impacts, but as sort of implied earlier, and as Leo was saying, and what we're looking for is operating on sort of rules of subsidiarity, sort of at the lowest level can you actually effectuate change, but also deliver and supply the needs of a community, of a place, without having to sort of extenuate beyond means. And that sort of eliminates some of the need for this regulatory framework. If you can make decisions and supply and meet needs at that sort of lowest level of subsidiarity, and then make sure there are different levels of subsidiarity that are connected intentionally and powerfully through policy, then you sort of eliminate the need for that globalized regulation. I mean, we need to do that now because of where we are in the system within which we exist. But ultimately, the goal is not to regulate this on a global scale. We should be operating at a sort of level that we can sort of live within our bounds and meet our own needs without sort of creating all of these ripple impacts in a global space. So that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for the global in the future, but that role in the future should be one of solidarity, should be one of support, of evening out inequities, right? Of redress of injustice, but it shouldn't be to meet our needs and then sort of police around the edges of the externalities of that process. So we need that now, but that's not that this should be an interim. We are into, this is an interregnum, right? What it's dying and we don't know what's new and we need to get there, but ultimately we don't want to see what we have now as our future. We don't need to have that sort of regulatory framework. We need to be able to go down to the lowest possible level and meet our needs within that.
There is a question which is, I think, a very good question for finishing, directed to all of us by Ronan O'Brien. And perhaps I start with this. One of the motives for organizing these events is exactly this, and directing it towards the question of policy space. I think we have not talked a lot about this, and I think Heikki made a very good contribution clarifying what he understands as reformed types of global governance, and then we can discuss the feasibility and the strategies, etc. But I think what is urgently needed, and why I consider Sarah's initiative important, but we need more than this, is that we need at the local, at the national level, the audacity to take decisions. And I think that's really horrible how politics has abandoned this idea that it can make a difference. And in Europe, it was the last experiment was the Mitterrand government in '81 that tried to differ. In the US, very often one refers to Roosevelt, and is surprised that an apparently very conservative President Biden is implementing more than one expected. And I think there is room for taking decision. There is an awareness that important decisions have to be taken due to climate crisis and other threats. And I think it needs politicians with courage, but if you look at the Green New Deal, that will only become possible with progressive social movements, political movements putting pressure, cooperatives, grassroots, and internationally organized civil society putting pressure on decision makers, and decision makers acting in a very different way than they did in the past. Because if we stick to this consensus-oriented type of politics of the last decades, the next 5 years will not be very different from the way it had been. So that's why, and that's also one of my intentions with the next discussion, really to push towards using policy spaces, and in this sense using all possible policy spaces, not acting one, saying this is the good one, this is the bad one, but take the chances of a progressive mayor in Paris and other cities, take national governments, and you see how much money, even under the current precarious majorities in the US, a US president has, and directed towards social ecological, a different type of economy. That would be my answer. That is this very probable, I would say no, yeah, but I think it's probably the most urgent thing we need. That would be my final words, but I leave it. We have three more that might add on this, and I think it's a very nice and good question to finish this webinar. Julia, Sarah, Heikki, any further words? What should be done the next years? What's urgently needed?
Well, I might start. I totally agree with what you've just said. I think the left, or people that are considering themselves progressive or that want this kind of social ecological transformation, however you want to frame it, they need to develop a vision, and based on this vision, a strategy on how to get there. And this is what I'm missing a bit now in many political debates. It's exactly about what we've said before. It's about alleviating the worst consequences of capitalism. But with this, you do not win elections, as we say in German. And with this, it's hard to compete with the right-wing people who actually say the same, but they have more tools. If you remain inside the system, they have definitely more tools to reach this goal of alleviating for the groups that they consider worth of being alleviated of the worst consequences. But if I say, okay, that's not my goal, I want to improve the system as a whole, or to change the system, I would rather say that, then you need to have this kind of, on the one hand, political strategy and policymakers that try to push for that strategy, but you also need to have these movements backing those politicians. So it's not only pressuring them, it's also backing them, because in the political system, for them, it will be hard to get through with very radical proposals. And it needs to become clear also on the political level that there is people in the society that agree that we need some far-going change.
I absolutely agree. I'll follow up on that, but I'll just add to say that that you need the pressure, but it's not just the pressure. You need the experimentation. You need the proof that alternatives exist and that they work. You need models. You need solutions, and the good news is we actually have them. They do actually exist, and they're not new. You know, we refer to community wealth building. It's a title we've given to a network of things that have existed, you know, in places, in various forms at different scales for generations. So we actually know what we need to do. We know what would be better. We just need to surface that, scale it, project it, get it in front of the leaders and the policymakers and the people having these conversations. So we do need that audacity, but we need that audacity rooted in what works, and we know what works, and we need to get that there. And you know, I would argue that part of doing that is for the left to actually stop eating itself. The left is very good at finding division and rather than unity. We all know this, you know, and so how can we sort of get around what does make a difference in people's lives and get that up to the level of the audacity that we need and the time that we have, because it's absolutely right, Ronan, we don't have a lot of time, and we do need to experiment, but we have been experimenting, so we can do it, and we just need to get it up there.
Thank you, Sarah. Just also we're in the final round, but I wanted to ask you this question. Do you think it, and with the current Biden administration, that's easier? Things have changed, or do you consider this a minor and not a substantial difference?
An opening. I think as a result of the American Recovery Funds that you see coming down, a lot of those existing initiatives will gain support and capacity that will maybe get to a point where you start to see that tip, or you start to see that influence. So I think we have an opening. I think it's a short one, you know, and you know, we're talking about 18 months maybe. And so there's an interesting possibility right now. Again, I don't think we need to pin all our hopes on the Biden administration by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there's a real opportunity to take advantage of this moment to really get to that sort of next level that we need to get to in order to have that influence and that reach.
Thank you, Sarah. The last word is yours, Heikki.
Thank you. The things are not standing still while history is moving on all the time. Things are changing. The era of neoliberalism is already drawing to a close. I have many scenarios about what will happen in the next 10 years. Some of those involve also major crises, even catastrophes, even global wars. There are different possibilities. However, I want to close this session, at least on my part, by saying what needs to be done next. And I think the next thing is to create world political agents in a form that has never existed before. The next step is to found a global political party. I've been developing on that idea, and if you want to Google, you can find my writings on that topic.
Yes, we found it very easily when preparing for this webinar, so all of you can find it very easily these days on the web. Yeah? Have a look at it. Thank you very much, the discussants, the audience, those who stayed until now, and we will keep you informed on the next webinar, on our summary of this event. And if you have not done this, you are warmly invited to how do you say, to subscribe to the newsletter of the International Karl Polanyi Society, where you get all the information of the events. But hopefully you already are. If not, please do this. That's the surest way of getting all the informations. You find it also, if you don't have the newsletter, you find it on the website of the Polanyi Society, where you can look up the other events, and you will get in a few days, this event will be available to you as well. Melissa posted it in the chat, very easy to find it. Have a nice evening or day, Sarah, for you, and enjoy the summer. These days one is recommending it's not too hot. That's different from some years ago. Yeah, not too hot summer. Enjoy it, and hopefully we meet in September with the next webinar. Bye-bye.